Have you ever wondered what it takes to survive when everything you've built crumbles around you? This is a story of resilience, betrayal, and unexpected redemption in the unforgiving frontier. The Wyoming wind carried whispers of desperation through the valley as Isabel Hartwell stood at her father's bedside, watching the man who'd raised her alone fade into shadows. Victor Hartwell had been a force of nature once, a rancher who'd carved civilization from wilderness with nothing but determination and calloused hands. He'd arrived in the territory 25 years ago with a pregnant wife, a wagon full of dreams, and enough stubborn pride to move mountains. Now, consumption ravaged his lungs, each breath a battle he was losing. The room smelled of camphor and decay, the curtains drawn against the harsh afternoon sun. Isabel had barely slept in weeks, keeping vigil beside him, watching the color drain from his weathered face day by day. She'd sent for doctors from as far as Cheyenne, spent money they didn't have on medicines that promised miracles, and delivered nothing but false hope. "The ranch," he rasped, gripping her hand with surprising strength. His fingers, once strong enough to wrestle steers to the ground, felt like bird bones in her palm. "Promise me you'll save it." Isabel nodded, though the weight of that promise threatened to crush her. The Hartwell Ranch was drowning in debt, vultures circling in the form of creditors and rival ranchers eager to claim their land. Her father had made enemies, chief among them Thomas Blackwood, whose empire stretched across 3 counties, and whose reputation for ruthlessness preceded him like a storm. Blackwood had spent years trying to acquire the Hartwell land, making offers that were barely disguised threats, cutting off access to water rights, and spreading rumors that drove away potential buyers for their cattle. Victor had resisted every attempt, every manipulation, every underhanded tactic. It had cost him everything: his health, his fortune, and ultimately his life. What Isabel didn't know was that salvation would arrive, wearing her enemy's face. 3 days after they buried Victor on the hillside overlooking the valley he'd loved, Nathaniel Blackwood appeared at their door. Isabel answered with a rifle in her hands and murder in her heart, expecting another of Thomas's schemes to finally take what he'd always wanted. But Nathaniel stood there, hat in hand, eyes the color of winter steel, and something in his expression stopped her finger on the trigger. He was Thomas's son, though the resemblance ended at their shared surname. Where his father was cruel and calculating, Nathaniel carried himself with quiet dignity. Where Thomas destroyed everything he touched, Nathaniel seemed to build and mend. She'd heard stories about him in town, how he paid his workers fair wages, how he'd once ridden through a blizzard to bring medicine to a homesteader's sick child, how he'd quietly opposed his father's most vicious business practices. "I have a proposition," he said, his voice low and measured. "Marry me, and I'll clear your debts. The ranch stays in your name. You maintain complete control. I ask nothing except that you give me a chance to prove not all Blackwoods are cut from the same cloth." Isabel's first instinct was to slam the door in his face. A Blackwood offering help was like a rattlesnake offering a handshake. There had to be venom hidden somewhere. But desperation makes strange bedfellows, and she was drowning in a sea of unpaid bills and threatening letters from the bank. "Why would you do this?" she demanded, searching his face for deception. "Because my father's legacy is built on broken families and stolen land," Nathaniel replied, meeting her gaze without flinching. "I've watched him destroy good people for 30 years. I'm trying to build something different. I'm trying to be different. Your father was a good man who deserved better than what my family did to him. Let me make it right." The sincerity in his voice was almost harder to bear than cruelty would have been. Isabel wanted to hate him, needed to hate him. But something in those steel-gray eyes spoke of genuine remorse and determination. She gave him her answer the next morning. "Are you ready to discover how 2 people from warring families forge an unlikely alliance? The journey ahead will test everything they believe about loyalty, trust, and love itself." The wedding was a quiet affair. No celebration, no guests, just signatures on paper that bound their fates together in the dusty office of a circuit judge who asked no questions and offered no congratulations. Isabel wore her mother's dress, altered to fit her taller frame, and felt like a traitor to her father's memory with every step down that makeshift aisle. She moved into the Blackwood estate with a single trunk of belongings and a heart full of suspicion. The house was massive, built from timber and stone, a monument to Thomas Blackwood's ego and ambition. Isabel expected coldness, perhaps cruelty, certainly the kind of calculated manipulation her father had warned her about. What she found was something far more unsettling: kindness. Nathaniel gave her the entire east wing of the house, a suite of rooms with windows overlooking the mountains. He never entered without knocking, never demanded what she wasn't willing to give, never mentioned the marriage contract that legally bound them. He worked alongside his ranch hands from dawn until dusk, mending fences and breaking horses, his hands as calloused as her father's had been. At dinner, the only time he requested her company, he asked about her day, listened when she spoke about her dreams of expanding the cattle operation with new breeding techniques, and shared his own vision of sustainable ranching that worked with the land rather than against it. He was nothing like she'd expected, and that terrified her more than cruelty ever could. But Thomas Blackwood was a different story entirely. The patriarch watched their arrangement with barely concealed contempt, his eyes calculating, always searching for weakness. He built his empire on exploitation and intimidation, crushing anyone who stood in his way. He saw Isabel as an interloper, a threat to his control over his son, and he made no effort to hide his disdain. "You think you've won something," Thomas told her one evening when Nathaniel was away checking on a sick mare. He'd cornered her in the library, blocking the doorway with his considerable bulk. "But you're just another piece on the board, girl, a pawn playing at being a queen. And I always win. Always. Your father learned that lesson too late. Don't make the same mistake." Isabel refused to be intimidated. She'd survived her father's illness, near bankruptcy, and the harsh Wyoming winters that killed weaker souls. One bitter old man, no matter how powerful, wouldn't break her. She met Thomas's gaze without flinching and walked past him as if he were nothing more than an inconvenient piece of furniture. As weeks turned to months, something unexpected happened. The walls between Isabel and Nathaniel began to crumble, brick by careful brick. She discovered he shared her love of early mornings, when the world was still and possibility hung in the air like mist. They'd meet on the porch before dawn, coffee steaming in their hands, and watch the sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. He taught her to read the land, to see the stories written in animal tracks and weather patterns, to understand the delicate balance of the ecosystem they were part of. She showed him her father's journals, filled with dreams of sustainable ranching practices that honored the land rather than exploiting it. Ideas that had been dismissed as foolish by men like Thomas Blackwood. They became partners in truth, not just on paper. They rode out together to check fence lines, worked side by side during calving season, and spent evenings planning improvements to both ranches. Isabel found herself laughing at his dry humor, appreciating his quiet strength, and slowly, so slowly she barely noticed it happening, falling in love with the man she'd married out of desperation. But Thomas wasn't finished playing his games. When he discovered Nathaniel had been secretly helping other struggling ranchers, offering fair prices for their cattle, extending credit without crushing interest rates, undermining his father's systematic attempts to buy their land for pennies on the dollar, the confrontation was explosive. Isabel heard the shouting from across the house. She ran to Thomas's study to find father and son facing each other like bulls ready to charge, years of resentment and disappointment finally boiling over. "You're weak," Thomas snarled, his face purple with rage. "Soft and weak, just like your mother was weak. She filled your head with nonsense about honor and fairness, and look where it got her. Dead and forgotten while I built an empire." "No," Nathaniel said quietly, but there was steel in his voice that Isabel had never heard before. "I'm just not you. And I thank God for that every single day. Mother wasn't weak. She was kind. She was decent. She was everything you'll never be. If you walk out that door, you're done," Thomas threatened. "I'll cut you off from everything. The Blackwood name, the fortune, all of it. You'll have nothing." Nathaniel looked at his father for a long moment, and Isabel saw something shift in his expression, a final severing of chains that had bound him his entire life. I'll have something you've never had, Father. I'll have a clear conscience. I'll have people who respect me instead of fear me, and I'll have her." He took Isabel's hand, and together they walked out of Thomas Blackwood's house for the last time. The break was final and absolute. Thomas disowned his son publicly, cutting him off from the Blackwood fortune and spreading vicious rumors throughout the territory. Isabel expected Nathaniel to resent her, to blame her for the rift with his father, to regret the choice that had cost him everything he'd grown up with. Instead, he seemed lighter, as if a burden he'd carried his entire life had finally been lifted from his shoulders. "I should have done that years ago," he admitted, as they sat on the porch of the Hartwell Ranch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. "I was so afraid of becoming him that I never realized I could choose to be someone else entirely. I spent 30 years trying to change him, trying to earn his approval, trying to make him see that there was a better way. But you can't change someone who doesn't want to change. You can only change yourself." That night, for the first time, Isabel kissed her husband, not out of obligation or gratitude, but because she wanted to. Because somewhere along the way, the stranger she'd married to save her father's legacy had become the person she trusted most in the world. Because she'd fallen in love with his quiet strength, his unwavering integrity, and his gentle hands that could calm a frightened horse or hold her like she was something precious. Together, they built something new from the ashes of their father's war. The Hartwell Blackwood Ranch became known throughout the territory for fair dealing and innovative practices. They implemented her father's sustainable grazing techniques, invested in better breeding stock, and treated their workers with respect and fair wages. Other ranchers sought their advice, and slowly, the culture of exploitation that Thomas Blackwood had fostered began to change. It wasn't easy. There were hard winters when they wondered if they'd make it through, droughts that tested their resolve, and the constant pressure of Thomas's attempts to sabotage their success. But they faced every challenge together, their partnership growing stronger with each obstacle overcome. Years later, standing in the same valley where her father had once fought for survival, Isabel watched their children play in the meadow. 2 boys and a girl, all with their father's gray eyes and their mother's stubborn determination. Nathaniel's arm was warm around her shoulders, solid and real, a comfort she'd never expected to find. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Marrying me? Everything it cost you?" She smiled, remembering the desperate woman who'd agreed to marry a stranger to save her father's legacy, who'd expected nothing but disappointment and found everything she'd never known she needed. "Not for a single moment. You gave me back my father's dream and gave me a new one I didn't know I was allowed to have." "What dream was that?" "A partner, a family, a love I didn't have to fight for or earn. You just gave it freely." He pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You earned it every day by giving me the same thing. You saw past my father's sins and gave me a chance to be my own man." Sometimes the greatest victories come from the most unlikely alliances. What impossible situation in your life might be transformed by choosing courage over fear? The frontier taught them that survival isn't about standing alone, it's about knowing when to reach across the divide and build something better together. Their story reminds us that redemption is always possible, that love can grow in the harshest conditions, and that the family we choose can be stronger than the legacy we inherit. What bridges are you ready to build?